okay to have juice once in a while, but it's not great for you. So that's why soda water is better.
Or it's better when you make it yourself, please don't add any sugar. How'd that guy get in?
How did that guy get it? Because he worked, he flew all over the room.
Yeah, and he's gonna make it. So he's gonna make it.
You're gonna see how the gun works. See, right? You wanna get out?
He's gonna make it.
Come on.
Folks, the way this is going to work
What's that though?
is that I'm going to load and fire one shot from this weapon. It's going to be a bit loud. If you don't like
I think.
loud noises, if your hearing tends to be fairly sensitive, like youngsters, you want to use the palms of the hands over your ears when I say present your piece. After I fire, I'll tell you more about the weapon, including what it was, why the English needed it, how they used it, how that affected our history, and then we'll fire one more shot. And then at 4:15, we will have an artillery demonstration right outside the Fort Lawn. So here we go. As I said, it can be loud. If you don't like loud noises, this would be the time to cover your ears like so.
Yeah.
Present your face. Good. Put.
That was really loud.
Demonstration, folks.
That
My name's
was
Terry Bond.
really
You can
loud.
think of me as a recreated musketeer at our recreated Fort of King James. Now, you might have heard the term musket before. You might or might not have what would be, say, the official definition of it. Some modern folks seem to think that musket is just a term for any old black powder firearm. It's not. It's a very specific weapon in history. And basically, it's a weapon that was designed by the military, let's say about 50 years before Jamestown, to do something that the previous firearms on the battlefield, arquebuses, calibers, etc., couldn't do. And that was to punch through enemy armor at 100 yards. And they managed it by creating a weapon that fired about a fourth of a pound of lead, 75 caliber ball or larger, and dubbed that weapon the musket. So again, musket is a very specific term. You'll see that term being used down through the next 250 years to refer to large caliber military firearms. Never such a thing as a hunting musket. Never such a thing as a target musket. At least not made for that purpose. You had target weapons, target rifles, hunting pieces, fowling pieces, but you didn't have hunting muskets. Is everyone clear how that works? Well, if it helps, another way to think of it, this is the AK-47 of the 1600s. It's strictly for military. It's not really well suited for anything else. But it's very well suited for its task. How many folks have heard that these weapons weren't very accurate? And you figure you'd want a weapon that was reasonably accurate for military, right? Well, the problem is that some modern writers have gotten it in their heads, and I still can't figure out, based on what, that these weapons weren't very accurate, when what we read in the original 1600s and 1500s and 1700s documents is that you weren't going to accept a soldier for service as a musketeer until he could prove, by doing it, that he could put something like this somewhere in a man-sized target at that 100-yard distance. That same distance where this will punch through armor. Now, I know I've mentioned that out here in the past, and we've had some competitive shooters in our crowd at times. Target shooters have shaken their head at that. That's not accurate. And when questioned, I found those folks had never served in the military, nor had they ever studied military science. Because this is not a civilian target weapon. What is it?
A musket.
Combat weapon, a musket by definition a combat weapon. Yeah, it's for shooting down enemies who are trying to shoot you down. And if you can aim at your enemy in combat, and you aim here, and the best you manage to do is hit him here, or here, or here, or, oh I know, here, and he's not shooting back at you, haven't you been accurate? Combat accuracy is always different from that range accuracy. So, very good combat weapon. This weapon, I can speak from my own experience and the experience of others, this does allow an average shooter the ability to hit a man-sized target at that 100-yard distance as long as these cooperate. I'm now of an age where I can't do that anymore. That's not the fault of this. It's the fault of these 62-year-old eyes. But 30 years ago, I could. 30 years ago, I could put this where I wanted it at 50 yards. I'm an average shot. We have staff who still, and they're 20 years younger than I am, who can put this where they want it at 100 yards. They're no different from the 17th century guys. So when you hear the folks tell you these weapons weren't very accurate, it's compared to what? I mean, compared to a modern target rifle, sure. But it's all about comparison. So that's what the weapon can do. Let's talk about what you couldn't do with this. It's a single shot weapon, so you're not going to be able to load it once and fire it multiple times, and you're not going to be able to load it quickly by modern standards. It's going to take about 20 seconds to load one shot. Let me show you what that looked like in the 1600s. To load, you had the prime powder from this flask into the pan on the side. We close that pan, cast the weapon around, open one of these strange looking things that you may not for duck calls. No such thing in our country. Going to open that, pour all that powder down the barrel. It's a pre-measured load of powder for the weapon. Makes the job of the soldier in combat a lot easier. Take a bullet like that one I held up earlier. That 75 caliber ball from the pouch. Drop it down the barrel. Oop. There's more bullets that way. Ram that charge down. Make sure it's tight against the powder. If you have any space between the bullet and the powder, you're going to have a problem. Because when that powder goes off, if there's space like that, it's going to blow out the breech. That would be a not good thing. Once you've rammed that ball down, to ignite the weapon, you're going to set this match, slow-burning fuse called match, hemp cord treated with potassium nitrate. Set that into the lock, so hence the term match lock musket. Open that pan, squeeze the trigger. The action of the trigger brings that down to touch the powder. When that hot coal hits the powder here, that ignites. There's a vent that pulls that heat through, sets off the powder inside, sends the ball along. Everyone clear how that works?
Yes.
But the fastest we can do that, because of all the steps involved, is about 20 seconds. 3 shots in a minute, so to speak. Sometimes slower, depending on the soldier. So there's a problem. How are you going to use a slow-loading weapon like that in combat? Now, admittedly, if you're fighting the Spanish back in Europe, and the English had just signed a peace treaty with the Spanish just a couple of years earlier, but they had been fighting them for 20 years. If you're fighting them, they had the same technology. So you might picture both sides having to take the same amount of time, but you ever notice that if you've just fired, the enemy might have held off firing until you've just fired, because now you've got an empty weapon? That's a bad thing. So what they did was to figure out a way to fire this as rapidly as possible and get as many shots as possible toward the enemy in the shortest possible time, even though they couldn't speed up the loading. That meant you needed lots of these. Lots of men lined up in multiple lines, facing the enemy. Anyone ever seen any pictures or images or photos of that sort of formation?
I have.
Men with these, yeah. And you might wonder, why would people stand out in the open like that, fire this weapon like that? It's the technology. It's the loading aspect. So, the way that worked in period, that front rank would fire, all the men in that line would fire, and they'd either move to the rear of the line and the next line would come up to where they stood, or, my favorite, that front rank fires and stays where they are as the next rank moves up from behind them and comes up in front of them. And then they fire. Third rank comes up ahead of them and they fire. Fourth rank, fifth rank, sixth rank. It's called firing at the introduction in our time period. But it allowed the soldiers to advance toward the enemy, firing as they went. And I've been able to train folks out through the last 3 decades. I've been able to train folks in an afternoon. If they were already checked out on this, I've been able to train large numbers of men to perform that tactic consistently in about 30 seconds. If I can train 20th and 21st century folks who did that in an afternoon, a 17th century sergeant certainly could. And we actually have some 17th century documents that sort of apply about 30 seconds. So you can get several hundred rounds toward the enemy in 30-second time. That's comparable to a modern machine gun. So if you ever wondered why they did that, that's why. Now, that's tactics developed in Europe, a weapon that develops in Europe, but we're not in Europe. You've heard the Spanish came to attack, planned to attack these folks, but never showed up. You know, we'll modify that. They showed up, but only with small numbers. Just enough to check things out. Never pushed into a fight. Who were these folks at war with here by 1610, here in Virginia? The Powhatans, the natives, those experts in the woods, those experts with the bows and arrows, those experts at ambush. If you were English soldiers in 1610, expert in this rank and file system, maybe you fought the Spanish that way, maybe you fought the Irish with it, now you're over here, now you find yourself fighting the Powhatans. Are you going to fight are you going to take on those native folks, those experts in ambush warfare? Are you going to take them on with that rank and file system? Or are you going to try to beat them at their own game? Let me give you a hint on this one. How many of you know those woods as well as the Powhatans did? You're like the English. Yeah, suddenly trying to beat them at their own game doesn't sound like as good an idea as it does in the novels or the movies, does it? And historically, the English don't seem to have tried to do that very often. Frequently, when they tried, they didn't do too well. But what they learned to do in Ireland that worked, and the Irish fought the same way the Powhatans did, with the exception that they had these, and the English had still defeated them in 1603. They figured they discovered they could take an assault force by water, land on the beach of that Irish town, move their men up in formation the way I described. Well, here we can do the same thing in 1610. We being the English in this conversation. The English could land on that Powhatan beach, that Powhatan town, at dawn, with the muskets, wearing armor that would stop the arrows, and use that same tactic. Now, how many of you think that worked? And again, I'll give you a hint. What language do we speak? What system of government do we use? Do we use Powhatan's government or English government?
English.
English. Yeah, 1619, they got in a truce with the Powhatans in 1614. 1619, they thought, well, you know, we got enough population here. A military law government doesn't work too well any longer. Let's have an English legislature. Let's elect representatives to make the laws for everyone else. That wasn't a new radical idea in 1619. That was just what you did if you were Englishmen. And we've been doing that since in this country for 402 years now. 403 years, my apologies. So this weapon, this technology, those tactics ultimately changed our history, set up the history for what we do today, the way we do things today. And so I think that's going to be worth one more shot. So here we go, folks. Present your piece. Good. Put. All right. And that concludes my demonstration, folks. Any questions at this point?